At its peak, over 8,000 workers made rifles on this island. Today, their factory is a housing estate. 1,200 homes on the ground where Britain once armed itself, the old machine shop walls tucked between modern flats like a secret nobody talks about. Stand in one of those courtyards on a quiet morning. The Victorian brickwork is still there, heavy, arched, built to last centuries. But the machines behind those walls are gone. The proof house where every rifle was test-fired before it left for the front is silent. Children ride scooters past windows that once shook with the sound of a nation making what it needed to survive. How does A works that armed the British soldier through 2 world wars? That gave its name to the most trusted infantry rifle of the 20th century. Become a place where people park their cars and put out recycling bins. The answer isn't a single betrayal. It's a sequence of decisions, each one reasonable on paper, that together dismantled something no amount of money could rebuild. The water is still here. That's the first thing you notice. The River Lee moves slowly past Enfield Lock, the same unhurried current that once carried barges loaded with iron and timber into the most important small arms works Britain ever built. The lock gates still stand. The navigation still runs its ancient course through the marshes of northeast London. And if you walk along the towpath on a quiet morning, past the joggers and the dog walkers and the mothers with pushchairs, you could almost convince yourself that nothing has changed. Almost. Because where the Royal Small Arms Factory once sprawled across its island of brick and water and noise, where over 8,000 workers once made the rifles that armed an empire, there are houses now. Cul-de-sacs, front gardens with recycling bins, a development called Enfield Island Village, over 1,200 homes built on land that spent the better part of 2 centuries serving a single, unbroken purpose, ensuring that the British soldier could fight. Some of the old buildings survive. You can see them if you know where to look. The heavy Georgian and Victorian brickwork, the long machine shop walls with their rows of arched windows, tucked awkwardly between modern flats and car parks. They're listed, Grade 2, protected by heritage law. But listing preserves fabric, not meaning. The bricks remember what they were built for. The estate agent's brochures do not. This was the Royal Small Arms Factory, RSAF Enfield. For over 170 years, from the reign of George III to the age of Margaret Thatcher, this patch of marshland at the edge of London was where Britain made its guns. Not all of them. Birmingham's trade supplied plenty, and Woolwich and Sparkbrook had their roles. But Enfield was the state's own works, designed, built, and run by the government to ensure that the nation's rifles were reliable, standardised, and available at the scale that empire demanded. The Lee-Enfield rifle was born here. Adopted in 1895, carried through both world wars by British and Commonwealth soldiers from the Somme to Kohima, from El Alamein to the hedgerows of Normandy. The most recognisable infantry weapon of the 20th century bore this factory's name. Not a brand. Not a corporate identity. A place. A works. A community of skill built on water and marshland, and the quiet, relentless conviction that a nation that cannot arm itself is a nation that cannot defend itself. And then it was sold, closed, demolished, and redeveloped. The decision was made in the late 1980s during a privatization that turned the Royal Ordnance factories, state-owned for generations, into assets on a corporate balance sheet. British Aerospace paid £190 million for the lot. Within months, Enfield's closure was announced. 1,200 jobs. Gone. The works that had armed Britain through 2 world wars, through Korea and Malaya and the Falklands, through every conflict of the imperial and post-imperial age, reduced to a land value calculation and a planning application. What replaced it wasn't ruin. It was something more unsettling than ruin. It was normality. Homes, schools, a supermarket. The quiet suburban order of a place that has forgotten, or been made to forget, what it used to be. This is a story about what Britain built at Enfield Lock, what it meant, and what it cost to let it go. Chapter 2. Built by the Board of Ordnance. Every factory begins with a problem. Enfield began with anxiety. In the early years of the 19th century, the British state was not confident in its ability to supply its own soldiers with weapons. The Napoleonic Wars had exposed the frailty of the existing arrangements. Government musket production was scattered, dependent on private contractors, and a small manufactory in Lewisham that had never been designed for the volumes that total war demanded. If Britain was going to maintain a global empire, and the men in the Board of Ordnance were very clear that it was, it needed a works of its own, purpose-built, government-controlled, capable of producing arms at a scale and a standard that no private supplier could guarantee. The Board of Ordnance found what it was looking for in the marshes. On the 11th of January, 1812, the board purchased a site at Enfield Lock on the eastern bank of the River Lee, in what was then the empty waterlogged fringe of North London. It was not an obvious choice. The land was low and damp. The nearest settlement was small. The roads were poor, but the water was everything. The Lee navigation, the canalised course of the river, offered transport for raw materials and finished arms. The natural flow could be harnessed for power, and the isolation, which might have seemed a disadvantage, was in fact precisely what the board wanted. A government arms works needed security. Marshland provided it. The man tasked with turning this sodden ground into a functioning factory was Captain John Bye of the Royal Engineers, the same officer who would later achieve fame overseeing the construction of the Rideau Canal in Canada. Bye designed the original works at Enfield Lock, workshops, stores, a proof house for testing finished weapons, all arranged around the watercourses that would drive the machinery and carry the product. It was military engineering applied to industrial purpose, disciplined, logical, built to last. By 1816, the works was operational. The first rifles and muskets began to leave Enfield Lock for the Army's stores, and a pattern was established that would hold for the next 170 years. The British state would make its own small arms, on its own land, with its own workers, answerable to its own inspectors. Not contracted out. Not farmed to the cheapest bidder. Made here, tested here, trusted, because the government's name was on every barrel. It was a modest beginning. The early works was small, a handful of workshops, a modest workforce, a fraction of the output that would come later. But the principle was set. Britain believed that certain things were too important to leave to the market. The armed forces rifles were one of them, and the works needed people. That was the other fact of Enfield's geography. If you built a factory in the marshes, you had to build a world around it. Workers couldn't commute from London. The distance was too great, the roads too poor, and the hours too long. So the state did what states do when they need labour in an inconvenient place. It built houses. Government Row came first, terraces of workers' cottages, plain and solid, brick-built for durability, arranged within walking distance of the factory gates. They would be rebuilt and expanded between 1854 and 1858 as the works grew, and they stand today, listed Grade 2. The domestic architecture of a community that existed because the factory demanded it. A school followed, a chapel, taverns. The Enfield Lock character appraisal describes how the works' isolation on the eastern marshes made self-sufficiency not just practical, but necessary. If the workers couldn't easily reach the town would have to come to the workers. This is a pattern you see again and again in British industrial history. The factory as a gravitational force, pulling houses and shops and churches and public houses into its orbit, creating a community that lives and breathes and sleeps according to the rhythm of the works. At Enfield, it happened early. By the mid-19th century, the Royal Small Arms Factory wasn't just a place where rifles were made. It was a place where lives were lived, where families settled, where children grew up understanding that the works was the reason their street existed, their school existed, their world made sense. The walk from Government Row to the factory gates was short enough that a man could be home for dinner and back at his bench inside an hour. That proximity wasn't incidental. It was ideological. The state wanted its workers close, loyal, and available. And the workers, for their part, had something that most industrial labourers of the period could only dream of: a government wage, a government house, and the quiet certainty that comes from making something the nation couldn't do without. Chapter 3. The American System comes to Enfield. For the first 4 decades of its life, the Royal Small Arms Factory produced weapons the way most works of the era did, with skilled hands, sharp eyes, and the patient, painstaking fitting of parts that were close to identical but never quite interchangeable. A lock might need filing to sit properly in a stock. A trigger guard might need adjusting. Each rifle was, in a sense, handmade, assembled by men who knew the feel of metal well enough to coax tolerance from imprecision. It worked, but it wouldn't scale. By the 1850s, the world was changing, and Enfield was being asked to change with it. The Crimean War had exposed the same old anxiety. Could Britain produce enough weapons fast enough to supply a modern army in a prolonged campaign? The answer, once again, was not quite. The old methods were too slow, the old volumes were too modest. And, across the Atlantic, something new was happening that would reshape everything. The Americans had solved the problem. Or rather, they'd solved a version of it. In the armories of New England, at Springfield, at Harper's Ferry, at the workshops of men like Samuel Colt, a system was emerging that the British would call, with a mix of admiration and unease, the American System of Manufactures. The principle was deceptively simple. Build machines precise enough that the parts they produce are truly interchangeable. No filing, no fitting. No skilled hand adjusting each piece to its neighbour, every trigger identical, every lock plate the same. Pull a component from one bin, drop it into any rifle on the line, and it fits. Perfectly. Every time. Interchangeability. It sounds like an engineering detail. It was, in fact, a revolution. In 1854, the Board of Ordnance authorised a transformation of the Enfield Works. A new machine shop was installed between 1854 and 1856. A long, purpose-built hall designed not around workbenches and hand tools, but around American-made machinery capable of producing parts to a tolerance that no human hand could match consistently. The machines themselves were imported from the United States, shipped across the Atlantic, and installed by American engineers who understood the system that British industry was only beginning to grasp. By 1857, the conversion was complete, and its significance was not lost on the men who understood what they were witnessing. The Science Museum records that the machinery supplied in 1857 for Enfield production represented the first application in the United Kingdom of the American system of manufactures. Interchangeability at industrial scale. This wasn't simply a factory upgrade. It was the moment Britain admitted that the future of arms production lay not in the craftsman's touch, but in the machine's precision. Enfield was where that future arrived. The results were immediate and staggering. The workforce swelled past 1,000. Output surged. By 1860, the works was producing nearly 1,800 rifles a week, a volume that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. A parliamentary question from August of that year recorded the House being told that Enfield was making not less than 1,000 excellent rifles each week at a cost of roughly £2 apiece. The government, making its pride in the works a matter of public record, reading productivity and cost into Hansard, as though the factory floor were itself an instrument of national prestige. And it was. That's the point the numbers alone can't quite convey. Enfield wasn't just producing rifles, it was producing confidence. Confidence that the British soldier would carry a weapon made to a standard that no enemy could match. Confidence that the supply would hold, that the next war, and there was always a next war, would not catch the nation scrambling for arms the way the Crimea had. Confidence that the state could do what the state needed to do, on its own terms, at its own works, with its own people. Walk through the old machine shop today, if you can find it, nested between modern housing blocks, and you're walking through the building where British manufacturing crossed a threshold. The brickwork is heavy, plain, built for function rather than beauty. The arched windows that once let light fall across rows of milling machines and lathes now look out on car parks and garden fences. But the walls remember. 1857. The year Enfield became modern. The canal basin sat close by. Barges could deliver raw materials almost to the machine shop door, and the railway connection that followed linked the island to the wider network of supply and distribution. Iron came in. Finished rifles went out. The logistics were as precise as the machinery. The Enfield Lock conservation appraisal describes how transport links were engineered to improve efficiency as output expanded, the factory becoming not just a place of production, but a node in an imperial bloodstream that ran from the marshes of North London to every garrison and front line in the world. And still, the community grew alongside it. The rebuilt Government Row cottages of 1854 to 1858 stood solid and plain, brick terraces for families whose daily walk to the works was measured in minutes. The school taught the children of the men who ran the machines. The taverns filled on Friday evenings with wages earned in the service of the state. The factory, the houses, the chapel, the lock, the navigation, they functioned as organs of a single body. The works was the heart. The houses were circulation. The lock was the throat through which everything flowed. Enfield was no longer a modest government workshop on a damp marsh. It was a system, a place that had absorbed the most advanced manufacturing principles in the world and bent them to the service of empire. And it was about to enter the era that would make its name immortal. Chapter 4. The Forge of the Empire. If there is a single object that carries the story of the Royal Small Arms Factory, that holds its pride and its purpose and its meaning in a form you can pick up and hold, it is the Lee-Enfield rifle. Adopted by the British Army in 1895, the Lee-Enfield would become the standard service rifle for over 60 years, remaining in frontline issue until 1957 and serving in various roles long after that. No other infantry weapon in modern history has been so closely identified with a single nation's military experience. The Lee-Enfield wasn't just a rifle, it was the rifle, the one the British soldier carried, the one he trained with, fought with, trusted with his life across 2 world wars and dozens of smaller conflicts that the history books tend to forget. And it bore this factory's name. Not a designer's name, not a corporation's brand, a place. Enfield. The works on the marshes. The island where the Board of Ordnance had planted a factory a century earlier because the nation needed to make its own guns. Every Lee-Enfield that left the works carried that origin with it, stamped into the metal, made here, proved here, trusted because the men and women who built it answered to the crown. The rifle itself was a thing of brutal elegance. The bolt action was fast. Trained soldiers could cycle it with a speed and fluidity that stunned opponents. 10 aimed rounds a minute in the hands of a competent rifleman, and more for the exceptional ones. The 10-round magazine was generous by the standards of the age. The weapon was reliable in mud, in sand, in the frozen slush of a Flanders winter, and the baking dust of a Mesopotamian summer. It wasn't perfect, no weapon is, but it was sound, and it was trusted, and that combination is what keeps men alive in the places where trust matters most. To say the Lee-Enfield won both world wars would be too much. Wars are won by soldiers, by logistics, by alliances and geography, and industrial depth and luck. But the Lee-Enfield armed the British and Commonwealth forces who fought those wars. From the volunteer battalions of 1914 to the conscript armies of 1939, from the Anzacs at Gallipoli to the Gurkhas in Burma, from the Canadians at Vimy Ridge to the South Africans in the Western Desert. It was there, in their hands. At the moment, it mattered. And it was made here, on this island, by these workers. Imagine the works floor at the turn of the century, the machine shop humming with the steady pulse of belt-driven lathes and milling machines, each one turning out components to the tolerances that the American system had made possible 40 years earlier, but that Enfield's own engineers had since refined and perfected. The air thick with the smell of cutting oil and hot steel. The sound, not a single noise, but a layered composition. The whine of metal on metal, the rhythmic thud of stamping presses, the clatter of parts dropping into bins, and beneath it all, the deep, constant vibration that ran through the floor and up through your boots and into your bones. A works in full production doesn't just make noise, it hums, it breathes, it feels alive. The men on that floor, and they were overwhelmingly men, in peacetime at least, knew what they were making and why it mattered. These weren't anonymous factory hands turning out consumer trinkets. They were government workers producing the infantry weapon of the British Empire. The quality standards were exacting. Every rifle was proved, test fired under controlled conditions, before it left the works. Inspectors checked tolerances, function, finish. The proof house was the works' conscience. Nothing left Enfield that hadn't been fired first. And the skills were passed down. Apprenticeships at the Royal Small Arms Factory were prized. A young man taken on at Enfield learned not just machining, but precision. Not just production, but standards. Published histories of the works document a long-running apprentice scheme that turned local boys into toolmakers, fitters, inspectors, and pattern room craftsmen. The aristocracy of the factory floor, the men who could read a blueprint and a micrometer with equal fluency. Fathers brought sons, sons brought nephews. The works absorbed families the way a river absorbs tributaries, and the community it sustained grew deeper with each generation. The women came when war demanded it. In peacetime, the works floor was a male domain, but wartime shattered that convention with the blunt logic of necessity. When the men went to fight, the women came to make the weapons they would fight with. The broader story of women in British war work is well documented by the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives. The huge expansion of female participation in munitions and industrial production during both World Wars. And the Royal Armoury's records. Women workers at RSAF following conscription measures. They learned the machines, they met the tolerances, they kept the works running while the men who trained them were using the products in places whose names would later be carved on memorials. This is the golden age the rest of the story will mourn. Not a single year, but a long arc. From the Lee-Enfield's adoption in 1895 through the Edwardian era, through 2 world wars, through the post-war decades when the works still hummed and the community still held and the walk from Government Row to the factory gates still meant something. It wasn't paradise. The work was hard, the hours were long, the noise damaged hearing, the oil got into everything, and the hierarchy of the works, foremen, inspectors, managers, the ever-present government bureaucracy, could be as rigid as the machines themselves. But it was real, it was skilled, and it mattered. If you stood at the Canal Basin in, say, 1943 and watched the barges loading finished weapons for transport, Bren guns and Sten guns stacked in crates, bayonets bundled, machine gun components wrapped and labelled, you would have been watching the factory at something close to its moral peak. Not its numerical peak. That belonged to the First War, with its 8,500 strong workforce. But its moral peak. The nation was fighting for survival. The works was answering. Every shift, every component, every proved barrel was an act of purpose. The state making what the state needed, on ground it owned, with people who understood exactly what was at stake. Chapter 5. A factory. The wars could not do without the numbers when they come, should hit like a drumbeat. Not shouted. Not dramatised, just stated plainly and allowed to settle. At the peak of the First World War, the Royal Small Arms Factory employed over 8,500 workers. 8,500. On a single island of marshland in northeast London, more than 8,000 people arrived every day to make the instruments of war, rifles, bayonets, swords, machine guns, in volumes that dwarfed anything the works had produced before or would produce again. Try to hold that number in your mind. 8,500 workers on a site designed originally for a few hundred. The factory didn't just expand, it swelled. Temporary buildings went up, shifts stretched. The works hooter, that deep, unmistakable sound that marked the change of shift and could be heard streets away, sounded over a workforce that had tripled in the space of 2 or 3 years. The marshes that Captain John By had surveyed a century earlier were now home to a small industrial city, every inch of it bent to a single purpose. And the products they made weren't abstractions on a balance sheet. They were the objects that soldiers held in their hands when the order came to advance. The Lee-Enfield rifle, the same weapon adopted in 1895, now refined and mass-produced on a scale its designers could never have imagined. Bayonets that would be fixed to those rifles in the moments before a trench assault. Swords for officers who still carried them, a tradition that the Western Front was bloodily disproving. Machine guns that would define the character of the war itself. Every one of them proved. Every one of them made to standard. Every one of them carrying, invisibly, the labour of the men and women who stood at the machines and met the tolerances, while the people those weapons were meant for stood in trenches 400 miles away. The Roll of Honour tells the other side of the story. The Royal Armouries project to document RSAF's wartime contribution is built explicitly around remembrance, names, records, the human beings behind the production figures. Because the factory's workers were not exempt from the war's appetite. Men who had made rifles in 1913 were carrying them in 1915. The community that had grown up around the works, the families of Government Row, the apprentices, the skilled men who knew the machines, sent its sons to the same battlefields that its products supplied. The works made the weapons. The town provided the soldiers, and the memorials, when they came, listed names that the factory floor would have recognised. The Second World War brought the same terrible mathematics, if at slightly reduced scale. Over 6,000 staff worked the Enfield site during the second conflict. Fewer than the First War's peak, but still an enormous operation. And the product range had shifted with the changing nature of warfare. The Bren gun, the light machine gun that would become as iconic to the British infantry section as the Lee-Enfield itself, was a key Enfield product. The Sten gun, that rough, cheap, desperately effective submachine gun that could be produced in quantities that more refined weapons couldn't match, was made here too. Tank-mounted and aircraft machine guns flowed from the works. The output was broader, more varied, adapted to a war that was fought in deserts and jungles and skies, as well as trenches. And again, the women came. Conscription stripped the works of its trained men, and women filled the gaps, operating lathes, inspecting components, keeping the production lines moving through the years when the country's survival depended on its factories as surely as on its armies. The broader story of women's war work is documented extensively by the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives, and the Royal Armouries records their presence at Enfield with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that the works could not have functioned without them. 6,000 workers. Bren guns and Sten guns and bayonets and machine guns flowing out through the canal basin and the railway link, into the supply chain, across the Channel and the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, into the hands of soldiers who would carry them into places with names like Arnhem and Monte Cassino and Imphal. The factory on the marshes, doing what it had always done, making what the nation needed, when the nation needed it most. There is a particular kind of pride that comes from wartime production. Not the pride of profit or market share, but the pride of necessity. The sense that what you are doing, today, on this shift, at this machine, matters in the most immediate and urgent way possible. That the barrel you are boring, or the stock you are shaping, or the trigger mechanism you are assembling will end up in someone's hands at a moment when their life depends on it working. That pride doesn't fade easily. It becomes part of a place's identity, woven into the stories families tell and the way a community understands itself. Enfield carried that pride long after the wars ended. The works had proved itself, not once but twice, as the factory the nation turned to when everything was at stake. The Lee-Enfield had armed the British soldier through both conflicts and would continue as the standard service rifle until 1957. The Bren gun had earned a reputation for reliability that soldiers spoke of with something close to affection. The Sten, for all its roughness, had done what it was designed to do, put automatic fire in the hands of every section at a price the war economy could afford. And the community held. Government Row still stood. The apprentice scheme still trained young men. The works hooter still sounded. The walk to the gates still meant a government wage, a skilled trade, and the quiet security of knowing that what you made mattered to someone, somewhere, who was counting on it not to fail. Chapter 6. The Peak and the Shadow. It cast. If you had to choose a single moment when the Royal Small Arms Factory stood at the summit of its purpose and its pride, the point from which every later event would seem a diminishment, you might choose a morning in the early 1950s. The war was over. The works had survived. The Lee-Enfield was still the standard rifle, still being produced, still trusted. The workforce, though smaller than the wartime peaks, was stable. The apprentice scheme was running. The community was intact. Enfield had earned something rare for a factory, the sense of having been tested by the worst the century could offer and having been found sufficient. Not glamorous, not celebrated in the way that Spitfire production was celebrated, or the code breakers, or the dam busters, but sufficient, reliable, there when it mattered, the works that didn't let the soldier down. And yet, this was also the moment, though nobody standing on the factory floor would have known it, when the conditions that would eventually destroy the works were already forming. Not dramatically, not through any single decision or any identifiable villain, but slowly in the way that tides turn, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The empire was contracting. The military commitments that had driven demand for small arms were shrinking year by year as colonies gained independence and the global garrison was drawn down. The production runs that had justified the work's scale during wartime, tens of thousands of rifles, hundreds of thousands of components, were giving way to peacetime orders that rattled around the factory like pebbles in a drum. The machines were still capable, the workers were still skilled, but the orders were thinning. The Lee-Enfield itself, that totem of the factory's identity, was approaching the end of its official service life. It would be replaced as the standard rifle in 1957 after more than 60 years of frontline use. A remarkable career for any weapon. But for Enfield, the change carried a deeper meaning. The rifle that bore the factory's name, the weapon that had made the works synonymous with British soldiering, was being retired. What would replace it was a question not just of engineering, but of identity. Meanwhile, the political landscape was shifting in ways that would have seemed unthinkable to the men who founded the works in 1812. The Board of Ordnance's conviction that the state must make its own arms, on its own land, to its own standards, was starting to seem less like a timeless principle and more like an expensive habit. Private industry was capable. Costs were under scrutiny. The post-war consensus that certain things belonged naturally to the state was fraying at the edges, quietly, in committee rooms and treasury papers, and the slow, patient arguments of men who believed that markets did most things better. None of this was visible from the factory floor. Not yet. The works hooter still sounded, the shifts still changed, the walk from Government Row still ended at the same gates. But the peak, when it came, was the kind that only reveals itself in retrospect, the highest point on a graph that nobody thought to plot at the time. The Enfield Lock Conservation Appraisal records what happened next in the dry language of local planning history. Post-Second World War downturn. Half the site closed in 1963. The remainder eventually following in 1987. By the mid-1960s, the area around the lock had become visibly dilapidated. Production running down, maintenance deferred, buildings standing empty or underused. The slow, visible decay of a place whose purpose was ebbing away. This was the moment, the highest point before everything changed. And standing at that summit, looking out across a works that had armed the empire, had proved itself through 2 world wars, had built a community from marshland and purpose and the patient accumulation of skill, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were about to walk off. The decisions that would end the Royal Small Arms Factory were already being made. They just didn't know it yet. Decline, when it comes to a place like Enfield, doesn't announce itself. There is no single morning when a foreman looks at the order book and says, "It's over." Instead, the thing happens gradually, the way a river silts up, The way paint peels, the way a building that was once maintained every quarter starts being maintained every year and then not at all. The work thins, the shifts shorten. The workforce shrinks by natural wastage. Retirements not replaced, apprenticeships not filled, vacancies left open because the orders don't justify filling them. By the early 1960s, the Royal Small Arms Factory was living in the long shadow of its wartime purpose. The wars were over. The empire was contracting. The military establishment that had once consumed rifles and machine guns in volumes measured by the 100,000 was now placing orders measured in the low thousands. Enough to keep the machines turning, but not enough to justify the sprawling infrastructure of a works built for total war. Half the site closed in 1963. That single fact, recorded in the Enfield Lock conservation appraisal with the matter-of-fact brevity of planning history, contains a world of consequence. Half the site. Not a building here, a workshop there, half of everything. Machine shops that had hummed through 2 world wars standing empty. Roof lines unbroken by chimney smoke. Windows going dark. The physical landscape tells the story more honestly than any balance sheet. By the mid-1960s, the area around Enfield Lock had become visibly dilapidated. The conservation appraisal records it plainly. Production running down, buildings deteriorating, the slow creep of neglect that overtakes any industrial site when the money stops flowing and the maintenance schedules stretch and the weeds begin to push through the cracks in the yard. Fly tipping appeared. Boarded windows. The unmistakable look of a place that is no longer quite sure what it's for. And yet the community didn't simply accept it. There's a detail in the appraisal that matters. A record of volunteer clean-up and rehabilitation efforts in the area around the lock. Local people, seeing the place they'd grown up in sliding toward dereliction, organised to push back, cleared rubbish, tidied towpaths. Did what communities do when they sense that something precious is being allowed to rot. They tried to hold the line with their own hands. It's a small detail, but it's an important one. Because it tells you that the people who lived around the Royal Small Arms Factory didn't experience the decline as an abstraction, as a line on a graph or a policy discussion in Whitehall. They experienced it as weeds in the car park, as a mate who retired and wasn't replaced, as a building they'd worked in for 20 years standing empty and padlocked. And when they saw it happening, some of them fought it the only way they could. The Lee-Enfield had been replaced as the standard service rifle in 1957. The weapon that bore the factory's name, that had been its defining product for over 60 years, was gone from frontline service. New weapons followed. The works was still producing, still fulfilling government contracts, but the identity had shifted. Enfield was no longer the place that made the rifle. It was a place that made things for the Ministry of Defence. The distinction sounds subtle. It wasn't. It was the difference between a name that meant something to every soldier in the Commonwealth and a line item in a procurement budget. The political ground was shifting too, though slowly enough that the tremors might not have been felt on the factory floor. The post-war consensus, that certain industries belonged in state hands, that government ownership guaranteed quality and reliability and fair employment, was under increasing pressure, not just from the obvious political direction. The arguments against state-owned industry were being made across the spectrum. Too expensive, too slow, too resistant to change, too insulated from the disciplines of competition. The men who ran the Royal Ordnance factories, Enfield among them, were being asked, with increasing frequency, to justify their existence in terms that their founders would not have recognised. Not, can you make what the nation needs? But, can you make it cheaper than a private firm? The vulnerability was real. Enfield was a factory without a guaranteed future, a works whose purpose had always been defined by the state's need for arms, and whose scale had always been justified by the state's willingness to pay for self-sufficiency. When the need shrank and the willingness wavered, the factory was exposed. Not bankrupt, not incompetent, but exposed. Like a sea wall at low tide, waiting for the next storm to test whether the foundations still held. The storm, when it came, would be political. Would Chapter 8. Sold as a going concern. Closed as a place. To understand what happened to the Royal Small Arms Factory in the late 1980s, you need to understand a word that the people of Enfield Lock would come to hear with a particular bitterness: privatization. The idea was simple, at least in theory. Britain's state-owned industries, steel, coal, gas, water, telecommunications, and 100 smaller enterprises, including the Royal Ordnance factories, would be sold to private ownership. The arguments were well rehearsed. Private enterprise would be more efficient, more responsive to market signals, more disciplined about costs. Public ownership, the argument ran, bred complacency, overmanning, and a fatal insulation from the realities of competition. The nation's industrial future lay not in government workshops, but in the marketplace. For the Royal Ordnance factories, the network of state-owned arms works that included Enfield, along with sites at Nottingham, Chorley, Bishopton, and others, privatisation arrived in the mid-1980s. The factories were bundled together and offered for sale as a single entity, Royal Ordnance plc. A business, in the government's telling, with assets and liabilities, and a future that private investment would secure more effectively than state ownership ever could. In April 1987, British Aerospace completed the purchase. The price, £190 million for the lot. All of it, every factory, every contract, every worker, every square foot of land. £190 million for the state's capacity to arm itself. 4 months later, in August 1987, the closure of the Enfield works was announced. 1,200 jobs would go. 1,200 people. Machinists, inspectors, toolmakers, storekeepers, apprentices, administrative staff, canteen workers, security guards, cleaners. People who had walked through those gates every morning, some of them for decades, some of them following fathers and grandfathers who had done the same. People who had built their lives, their mortgages, their children's schools, their sense of who they were, around the certainty of the works. Told in August that the certainty was over. The closure was debated in Parliament. And the debate, preserved in Hansard, available to anyone who cares to read it, is one of the most revealing documents in the whole story of British deindustrialisation. Not because it settles the argument, because it stages it. Both sides, speaking on the record, in language that shifts between the measured and the furious, laying out the two competing versions of what had happened to the Royal Small Arms Factory. One version goes like this. Enfield was an ageing works in a changing world. Demand for small arms had fallen. The site was expensive to maintain. Private ownership would rationalise the Royal Ordnance estate, closing what needed closing and investing where investment would count. The sale wasn't a betrayal, it was a business decision. The £190 million reflected the value of the business as a going concern, with all its liabilities, pension obligations, and restructuring costs. Not the value of any individual parcel of land. Alternative use valuations, the minister argued, were complex and sometimes lower than existing use valuations. The numbers weren't as simple as the headlines made them seem. The other version goes like this. The government sold the nation's capacity to make its own weapons for a fraction of what the land alone was worth. British Aerospace didn't buy a business. It bought real estate with a factory attached, and moved within months to close the factory and unlock the real estate. The workers, the skills, the heritage of 170 years of state arms production, none of it mattered. What mattered was the value of the land when it was cleared and rezoned. The sale was undervaluation. The closure was asset stripping. The competition for the Royal Ordnance contract was, in the words used in the Commons debate itself, a charade. The language in the chamber was severe. Members described the closure as a tragedy. Allegations flew of prior knowledge that the decision to close Enfield had been taken, or at least understood as inevitable, before the sale was completed. That the workforce had been misled. That the promises of continuity that accompanied privatisation were hollow from the start. The minister replied with the careful, procedural language of a government defending a decision already made. The sale was of a business, not a single land parcel. Closure was not pre-decided. Valuation was conducted properly. The National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee had examined the matter. Both versions are in the public record. Both versions were argued by elected representatives on the floor of the House of Commons. And the documentary doesn't need to choose between them, because the devastating fact is the same regardless of which version you believe. The Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, the works that had armed Britain for over 170 years, that had employed over 8,000 people at its wartime peak, that had introduced the American system of manufactures to British industry, that had produced the Lee-Enfield rifle and the Bren gun and the Sten gun, that had built a community from marshland and given it purpose for generation after generation, was closed. The machines were stopped, the gates were shut, the workers went home for the last time, and the island where rifles were born began its slow transformation into something else entirely. Chapter 9. The Rifle That Broke Confidence. There is a word that runs through military culture like a vein through rock. It's not courage or discipline or duty, though those matter. The word is confidence. Confidence in your training. Confidence in the man beside you. And above all, confidence in your weapon. That when you need it, it will work. That the rifle in your hands will fire when you pull the trigger and stop when you release it, and do what it was designed to do at the moment when doing it is the difference between living and dying. The SA-80 broke that confidence. And the story of how it did so is inseparable from the story of Enfield's closure. Because the SA-80 was the last weapon system developed under Royal Ordnance stewardship before privatization, and its failures became the most public, most humiliating evidence of what happens when the chain between factory and soldier frays. When the SA-80 was brought into service in 1986, it arrived with 32 defects. That number, 32, was not an allegation from a disgruntled squaddy or a tabloid headline. It was the finding of the House of Commons Defence Committee, reported in 1993 and summarised by The Independent. 32 specific faults in a weapon that was supposed to be the successor to the Lee-Enfield tradition. The next chapter in a lineage that stretched back to 1895. Some of the defects were the kind that engineers might call teething problems, issues that could be resolved through modification and refinement. Others were more fundamental. The weapon performed poorly in sand, in extreme cold. In the conditions, in other words, that soldiers actually encounter when they go to war. Conditions that the Lee-Enfield had endured for 60 years without breaking faith. The Gulf War made the problems impossible to ignore. When British forces deployed to the desert in 1990 and 1991, the SA-80 went with them. And in the sand and heat of the Arabian Peninsula, the rifle's vulnerabilities were exposed with brutal clarity. A Ministry of Defence evaluation, released years later through Freedom of Information, described what happened in language that was all the more devastating for its restraint. The assessment, from Lancet's Operation Granby evaluation, reported that the SA-80 did not perform reliably in sandy combat and training conditions. Stoppages were repeatedly reported. And the evaluation stated, with the clinical precision of a military document, that it was quite clear that infantrymen lacked confidence in their weapon. Lacked confidence. In the field. In a combat zone. With an enemy in front of them. The evaluation went further. It recorded that some platoon commanders believed casualties would have occurred if the enemy had offered stronger resistance during close combat clearance operations. Read that again. British officers in the field believed that their soldiers could have died because their rifles could not be trusted to fire. This is not internet folklore. This is not the grousing of soldiers who always complain about their kit. This is a formal Ministry of Defence evaluation based on operational experience, stating in writing that the standard infantry weapon of the British Army could not be relied upon in combat. The Defence Committee report, as summarised in the press, acknowledged a more complex picture. Members of Parliament accepted that the SA-80 was accurate. It could hit what it was aimed at, which is, after all, the fundamental requirement of a rifle. And they noted that the weapon was now sound when properly maintained. But that qualifier, when properly maintained, carried a weight of its own. Soldiers in combat do not operate in conditions optimized for weapon maintenance. They fight in sand and mud and rain and cold. They go days without cleaning their rifles because they are busy not dying. A weapon that works only when properly maintained is a weapon that has failed to understand what soldiers actually do. The slow, expensive process of making the SA-80 work fell not to a British factory, but to a German one. In 2000, the Defence Secretary rose in the House of Commons to announce the intent to award a contract to Heckler & Koch, a subsidiary of Royal Ordnance, itself by then part of BAE Systems, to modify approximately 200,000 SA-80 weapons. The Defence Secretary's words were precise, and for anyone who understood what they meant, quietly damning. Service personnel deserve a reliable weapon in which they have confidence. Deserve a reliable weapon. That sentence acknowledges, without quite saying so, that they hadn't had one. The modification work was carried out in Germany. A Commons Defence Committee appendix records this. Modification undertaken by Heckler & Koch in Germany. A firm described at the time as British-owned, part of BAE Systems, but German in engineering, German in capability, German in the precision that the work demanded. The modified SA-80 passed stringent acceptance testing. It became, by most accounts, a competent weapon. The A2 variant, and later the A3, addressed the worst of the original's failings. But the irony was as heavy as the rifle itself. The Lee-Enfield, born at Enfield, made at Enfield, trusted for 60 years by every soldier who carried it, had been succeeded by a weapon that needed German engineers to make it work. The factory that had given its name to the most reliable infantry rifle of the 20th century had been closed, and the rifle that replaced the Lee-Enfield's successor had been fixed not on the banks of the Lee, but in the workshops of a European arms manufacturer. Britain's gun. Saved by German engineering. The forge of the empire reduced to a customer. Chapter 10. The last shift at Enfield. Bring it back from Westminster. Bring it back from the committee rooms and the Hansard transcripts and the acronyms of military procurement. Bring it back to the island. The closure was announced in August 1987. The works closed in the late 1980s. 1,200 jobs, recorded in parliamentary debate, gone. Those are the facts. Clean and administrative, the way facts tend to be when they belong to someone else. But facts don't clock out. Facts don't walk home for the last time through streets they've known for 30 years and try to explain to their families that the works that built this house, this street, this life, won't be there on Monday. Facts don't sit in a pub on a Friday evening with a wage packet that's the last one they'll ever collect from a job that their grandfather started. The people of Enfield Lock experienced the closure not as a policy outcome, but as a bereavement. Something had died. Not a person. Though the pain had that quality, that finality, but a way of living. The certainty that the works would be there, that the gates would open, that the skills you'd spent years learning meant something, that the community you'd built your life inside had a future. And what made the bereavement worse was the knowledge of what would come next. Because the works wasn't simply being shut down and left to rot. It was being shut down and sold. The land, the island, the waterways, the site that the Board of Ordnance had chosen in 1812, specifically because it was remote and secure and perfect for government arms production, was being measured not in rifles per week, but in houses per acre. The Hansard debate captures the moment when this became real. Members of Parliament argued over redevelopment valuations, numbers in the tens of millions and higher, figures that turned the factory floor into potential revenue and the workers' skills into an obstacle to be cleared before the real money could be made. Whether those figures were realistic is, in some ways, beside the point. What they did was translate 170 years of purpose into a land transaction. The forge of the empire reduced to a conveyancing problem. The workers who heard those numbers, in the papers, in the pub, through the union, through the whisper network that runs through every factory facing closure, understood something that the valuations couldn't express. They weren't being replaced by something better. They weren't being made redundant because their skills were obsolete or their products unwanted. They were being moved aside because the ground they stood on was worth more without them on it. That's the betrayal. Not the economics. Economics can be argued, and reasonable people can disagree about whether Enfield could have survived in a changed world. The betrayal is simpler and harder. It's the discovery that the thing you gave your working life to, the factory, the craft, the purpose, is valued less than the space it occupies. If there were ceremonial last shifts, final products completed, machines powered down for the last time, a works hooter sounding for the last time over a community that would never hear it again, the record doesn't preserve them in detail. What the record preserves is the number 1200, and what the landscape preserves is the absence. Chapter 11. From Factory to Enfield Island Village. The transformation, when it came, was thorough. The whole site was sold for housing development. Over 1,200 houses and flats have been built on the former Royal Small Arms Factory land. That number, 1,200 homes where 1,200 jobs once stood, carries its own grim symmetry, though nobody planned it that way. The development is called Enfield Island Village. It was built in the late 1990s and early 2000s on the island that Captain John Bye had surveyed, that the Board of Ordnance had purchased, that over 8,000 workers had once walked across every morning to make the weapons that armed an empire. The streets have the careful, inoffensive names of modern housing estates. The houses are neat. The gardens are tended. It is, by any reasonable measure, a pleasant place to live. Some of the old buildings survive. Enfield's conservation appraisal describes how listed factory buildings and some unlisted blocks were retained and integrated into the new development, worked into courtyards and streets, their heavy Victorian brickwork sitting alongside the lighter finishes of modern residential construction. The canal basin was partially reinstated, a nod to the waterways that had once carried iron and timber into the works and finished rifles out. The listed building's scale and materials remain legible from key views. You can still see the factory in the village if you know what you're looking at. But knowing what you're looking at is the problem. A family buying a flat in Enfield Island Village in 2003 might never know that the handsome brick building across the courtyard was once a machine shop where American-made lathes turned out rifle barrels to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The canal basin, partially restored, might seem like a pleasant water feature rather than the throat of an industrial organism that had once connected the works to the world. The arched windows might look Georgian. They might look charming. They don't look like what they are, the last physical evidence of 170 years of national purpose. Walk through Enfield Island Village on a weekday morning. The quiet is complete. No works hooter, no shift change, no clatter of boots on brick, no hum of machinery felt through the soles of your shoes. Children ride scooters past walls that once rang with the sound of rifle proof, the test firing that was the factory's final quality check, the last act before a weapon was stamped and shipped. A supermarket stands where production lines once ran. Recycling bins sit where finished Bren guns once stood in crates, waiting for transport to the front. The contrast isn't dramatic. That's what makes it so unsettling. There are no ruins here, no broken windows, no weeds through concrete, no romantic decay to photograph and mourn. The transformation was too complete for that. The factory didn't die and lie unburied. It was demolished, cleared, built over, and absorbed into the ordinary fabric of suburban London. The tragedy isn't visible. It's structural. It's in what isn't here anymore. The skills, the purpose, the capacity. Over 1,200 houses and flats, families living ordinary lives on extraordinary ground. And the brickwork where it survives, holding a memory that the estate agent's details will never mention. Chapter 12. What a country keeps, what it sells. The pattern room left first. Every weapon the factory had ever produced, every prototype, every variant, every experimental model and production standard had been preserved in the pattern room, the work's own archive of its craft. When the factory closed, the collection was displaced. It moved from Enfield to Nottingham and eventually to Leeds, where it found a permanent home as part of the Royal Armoury's National Firearms Centre. The guns survived. The factory that made them didn't. There is something in that displacement that captures the whole story. The objects were saved. The place was sacrificed. The rifles and machine guns and prototypes, the material evidence of what Enfield could do, are preserved in glass cases and climate-controlled stores, curated and catalogued and available for study. But the works where they were made, the community that made them, the living chain of skill and knowledge and identity that ran from the apprentice bench to the proof house to the soldier's hands. That chain was broken. You can't put it in a glass case. You can't catalogue it. Once it's gone, it's gone. And the question of what comes next lingers. A parliamentary written answer records that the projected out-of-service date for the L85A3, the latest variant of the SA-80 family, itself the weapon that replaced the Lee-Enfield's successor, is 2030. The replacement will be procured under Project Greyburn, described in formal industry notices as a defence equipment and support concepts stage effort to replace the SA-80 family. No investment decisions have been made. The project is in its earliest phase, a description on a government tender portal, a signal to the market that Britain will, at some point, need a new rifle. And when that rifle comes, whatever it is, wherever it's made, by whichever consortium or multinational arms manufacturer wins the contract, it will not be made at Enfield. It cannot be. Enfield is houses now. The machines are gone. The skills are gone. The workers who knew how to bore a barrel and true a chamber and prove a finished weapon are retired or dead, and the apprenticeships that would have trained their replacements ended when the gates closed. The island where rifles were born, the site chosen in 1812 because the water could drive the machines and the marshes could guard the secret. The works where the American system arrived in 1857 and the Lee-Enfield was born in 1895, the factory that armed Britain through 2 world wars with a workforce that peaked at over 8,500, is a housing estate. Pleasant, quiet, unremarkable. The Lee still moves past Enfield Lock. The same slow current, the same unhurried water that once carried the raw material of empire into a factory built on the conviction that some things are too important to leave to the market. The lock gates still stand. The navigation still runs. The listed brickwork of the old machine shop still holds its arched windows to the London light. But the machines are silent. The proof house is closed. The works hooter will not sound again. What Enfield was, not just a factory, but a principle, a national commitment to the idea that the state could and should arm its own soldiers with weapons made by its own people on its own ground. That principle was sold in 1987 for a share of £190 million. What replaced it was a housing development and a procurement process. The rifles that British soldiers carry today were fixed by German engineers. The rifles they will carry tomorrow will be chosen from a catalogue. And the island sits quiet. The water passes. The bricks stand. What a country keeps and what it sells. The answer is written in the silence of Enfield Lock.